ideas matter, and so does understanding the movement that carries them. So please welcome our next panel, which is asking the question that has become increasingly central in conservative debate. What has conservatism ever conserved?
Well, good morning, everyone. In some ways, this panel's title is a question, but it's often thrown at us as an accusation. What are conservatives ever actually conserved? To discuss this question today, we have Dominic Pino of the Washington Post. I will say that again. Dominic Pino of the Washington Post. Tony Woodlief of the wonderful State Policy Network, and Phil Magness, a man who has managed to be the #1 hate figure for both Nicole Hannah-Jones and Patrick Deneen. So I'd like to start us off way back in the mists of time when I first came to Washington in the late 90s. There were 3 areas where we were really on the defensive and conservatives were fighting tooth and nail. And those were tax rises. The Democrats wanted tax rises, gun rights, they were under severe threat, and Roe versus Wade, which conservatives wanted turned over, but which had become an article of faith to the Democrats. It seems that 30 years later, we've won, or thereabouts, on all 3 of those issues. So I'd like to ask each of the panel in turn, if you could just let me know, what do you think were, let's be positive, what have been conservatism's greatest victories over the past 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, overturning Roe versus Wade certainly is one of those. That was something that conservatives rightly were upset about for a long time, from a constitutional perspective, from a federalism perspective, and getting that overturned was the result of many, many years of very hard work by the conservative legal movement. It was not done by being angrier on social media. It was not done by wanting it more or being more purist about how much you wanted this goal. It was done by putting together a group of really talented and skilled attorneys, having the Federalist Society organize that effort, and get judges into the federal courts to get those decisions right. And it worked. It took a long time, and it worked. And now we see the results of that. The left has absolutely lost its mind about the Supreme Court, where they, want to pack the court, do all these things that even Democrats in Franklin Roosevelt's time didn't go along with, and they went along with him for pretty much everything. So that was that I think is really remarkable. And then you mentioned taxes. If you look at the United States compared to other rich countries, we're actually going to have an interactive editorial with the Post looking at some OECD data on this. And you can compare to other countries. It's astonishing how low taxes are for the middle class here compared to other places. The average worker in France making the average wage has about half of his income taken by the government. In the United States, it's only about 30%, right? 30% is still too high, by the way, but it's an astonishing difference compared to these countries. And then gun rights. The example I always like to go back to is constitutional carry and the spread of that through so many different states. It used to be called Vermont carry because for the longest time it was only a thing in Vermont, and now it's in a majority of our states. And so yeah, these are definitely 3 areas where media, Democrats in general, have been extremely harsh on conservatives, and we've just stood our ground and have advanced the ball.
Okay, you can hear me? Good, yeah. Honestly, when I first heard the question, I thought, well, what is the answer to the greatest conservative victories in the last 20 years? Is it TARP? Is it the second Gulf War that was a disaster? Is it 80% real dollar growth and federal spending? No Child Left Behind. Like what is it? So I think Dom is right about some of these things. I think my instinct is when we think about conservatism, I'm inclined to think less about a set of policy outcomes, which are arguably like a lagging indicator of the health of your republic, and think more about the institutions that allow you to conserve a way of life, a habit of being. And so that you might look at courts, you might look at a functioning legislature, if you have one. You might look at schools, you might look at churches, those kinds of things. So that would be where I would ask, okay, what are we, writ large, not just people in this room, what are we doing to preserve, protect, even extend the reach of those institutions? And it's probably a mixed bag, like Congress is in ruins. That was deliberately accomplished, I think. Courts are doing pretty good, I would say. And we have, a president not everyone likes, to at least thank in part for that. You got a reprieve for a while, 15, 20 years maybe. But I think that's where I would focus, is what are the institutions, how healthy are the institutions we count on to preserve the things that we care about.
And I echo both the others. This is our 250th year as a country, 230 some odd years under the same constitutional system, and it is functioning still pretty well. And I'd argue, as others have pointed out, that some of the legal victories we've had in the past 20 to 30 years have been pretty significant. Second Amendment is on a firmer constitutional standing today than it was 20 years ago. Roe versus Wade was resolved, I think, in the proper constitutional way of devolving it down to the states. We actually just won a big victory over assertions of unilateral presidential power on the tariff issue. Now the people that say, what have we conserved, don't like the outcome of that ruling, so therefore they attack it. But I think it's fundamentally a conservative ruling that brings us back to our original principle of no taxation without representation.
Back in the 90s, we forget just how radical Newt Gingrich's victory was. For so many years, for 40, 50 years, the Democrats have basically been in control of Congress. So in many ways, the Conservative project over the last 20 to 30 years hasn't been so much conserving as restoring things, trying to bring us back to ideas of the Constitution and of civil liberties and of speech and so on that have been ignored or trampled over for 40 or 50 years. So, Phil, perhaps you could expand a bit on the importance of restoring the Constitution to the Conservative project.
Well, I think much of the modern conservative movement emerged in the wake of the New Deal era, which was a vast expansion of federal power. A lot of that was directly enabled by some, what I would consider, very bad court decisions in the 1930s. Wickard versus Filburn was the notorious one where they said basically any act of economic activity, whether it crosses state lines or not, is interstate commerce because it affects the markets. We had major concessions made to delegating to the administrative state. Some of this has continued and expanded during the Warren Court era, which is a very mixed bag, but there are erosions on constraints on federal power that tend to play out. They're taken as a norm. And I think we've finally gotten to a point where a lot of those things are being questioned, and there's some pushback. So there's been a revival of the non-delegation doctrine, the notion that Congress can't give its powers away to the executive branch or an executive branch agency. There's been a return to actually investigating legislative intentions and comparing that to whether it is permissible under the original constitutional system. These were on the periphery of legal arguments just 25, 30 years ago. Now they're the dominant issue of cases that are coming before the courts.
Yeah, and Tony, obviously Conservatives are generally Federalists. Perhaps you could speak a bit about the revival of federalism and victories in the state level.
Yeah, I wish it were the case that all my conservative friends were Federalists, working on them. We're fair weather Federalists, some of us. So I think that probably the greatest movement for federalism has been in the courts. Like anytime you're restraining the capacity of unelected people in this city to make decisions that affect what my kids are taught in school, that's a victory for freedom and federalism. And so that's probably the most important thing. But what worries me I'm the resident pessimist. I don't know if you. And what worries me is you still have federal agencies making 20-some laws for every law that Congress manages to pass. Not that those are necessarily good laws that it passes. And you have states now twice as dependent on federal agencies for their revenue as they were in 1990, and showing no sign of stopping. You've got 22 states that now get a higher percentage of their revenue from the federal government than they did at the height of the COVID lockdowns. So that's a problem, right? Because those dollars aren't free. And so what I guess bothers me especially is people who call themselves conservatives in those states. They cut their taxes. 20-some states have done that in the last 10 years. They enact school choice, which is awesome, but it's a net spend unless you figure out how to shrink your public school footprint, which they don't want to do. And so then what do? Well, gosh, we don't have as much tax revenue coming in. We're spending more money. I know, let's go get Uncle Sam to pay the difference. So you can't call yourself conservative if that's what you're doing in your state, right? You're making your people more dependent on people here that nobody voted for, right? It's the opposite of conservative. So that would be the kind of the force moving in the opposite direction in terms of how healthy is federalism.
My colleague Wayne Cruz, I think you know, Tony, calls that imbalance of federal rules to laws passed by Congress the anti-constitutionality index. And Dom, I think this is an important point. You're not going to get away in a panel moderated by somebody from the Competitive Enterprise Institute without a question about the administrative state. The administrative state has grown and grown and grown over the past 30 years. We're currently at a plateau. We're not regulating anymore, but those regulations have piled up. Why are we still ruled by agencies that were designed in the 1930s and 1970s?
It's because, you mentioned before, Democrats controlled Congress for basically 40 years. And, stealing this from Grover Norquist a little bit, but he talks about how basically 90% of the federal government was created by two Congresses, the New Deal Congress and the Great Society Congress. And there has never been a Congress with a similarly sized majority composed of conservatives who are opposed to those things. It hasn't happened. And so in terms of a bigger, project for conservatives to work on, I think that would be it. A Congress that can actually go in and repeal a lot of these laws and get back to the Constitution as it's supposed to be. But then we can also look to state level successes on regulatory issues specifically. You look at what Idaho has done, for example, with sunsetting regulations. They said we're going to sunset our entire regulatory code. They did this a couple of years ago. And the agencies, instead of what it currently is, which is that the agencies have to, say which new regulations we want to add, we're going to get rid of all of them, and then the agencies have to defend the ones they want to keep, right? And so turning that burden of proof around, one, it made the agencies actually focus on, well, what's the core of our mission from the legislature as an agency, right? It's, if it's a health and safety agency, it's like, okay, so the regulations that are about health and safety, we're going to keep those. We're going to get rid of the ones that are just adding paperwork and causing all these other issues. They discovered regulations that no one had even really looked at in decades, and they just said, these are just irrelevant. We don't even need these anymore at all. And having them sunset all at the same time made it so that getting rid of them was automatic, and then keeping them was what you had to do some work for. And I don't know if people have been to Idaho, but I don't think houses are falling apart. I don't think people are getting sick in restaurants. I don't think there's like a huge problem with this. And they got rid of 30 or 40% of their regulatory code just from this sunsetting process. And so. And now those agencies, after that, they have regulatory budgets where they have to allocate in the most efficient way that they can how many new regulations they want to add. So it forces them to focus on what actually makes people's lives better. And so I think a reform like that at the federal level would be fantastic, right? We got to do something like that. But the idea that we've had about cutting regulations at the federal level have involved things like DOGE, which didn't do any of that, and has really not been focused on changing the rules about how we make the rules. because that's what's really rigged in the favor of unconstitutional delegations of power, and that's really what we haven't been able to undo.
For those of you who are interested in the Idaho case, there is an excellent paper by former Idaho official Alex Adams at the Competitive Enterprise Institute's website about this. I do recommend it. I do wonder, however, if to get back to something Tony was saying, how in many ways we've just been begging the question here that we can talk about these policy victories at whatever level, but isn't there are very strong arguments that conservatism is actually a disposition and it's an attitude, and to that extent, have we actually been promoting that attitude in a way that it still provides a motivation for people across the United States? Have we been concentrating too much on policy and not enough on that cultural attitude of conservatism?
I think there's several dimensions of that question that can come up. One relates, I think, to higher education in particular, because we have seen cultural shifts and ideological shifts that have taken place in the way that our public is taught. This has been something very acutely concentrated in the past 20 to 25 years. You go all the way back to William F. Buckley, Godwin Mann at Yale, campus was left-leaning, but there was always a plurality of the discussion that was moderate. There was also a plurality of the discussion that was conservative. There were places you could go to have deep intellectual conversations about different viewpoints. Now it's an echo chamber, a monocultural echo chamber, and if you watch the data, this is something that really only emerged in the past 20 years. So about the late 1990s, early 2000s to today, the left has moved from about 45% of campus, the university faculty, to, depending on which measure you look at today, it's in the neighborhood of 65 to 70%. And the remaining share is just dwindling on where our presence is in that portion of the cultural debate. It does spill over into the public sphere in some very pronounced ways. Some have called the mid-2010s the Great Awakening, with good reason. And you can actually see this in data. All this jargon like microaggression and intersectionality and terminology that used to be on the very far fringes of the critical theory left is suddenly all over the front page of the New York Times. And there's an uptick in it across every measure that you look at. I think that is an area where, for lack of a better word, we've ceded the front to the academic left. We've also been squeezed out, discriminated against. There are areas that non-leftists have been pushed to the margins of intellectual society. And the question is, well, what do we do about that? What comes from it? Well, one of the things that I'm seeing in very, very recent years is public patience for throwing gobs of money at higher education has more or less been exhausted. They've realized there's a connection between some of the cultural discussion and what they're seeing in day-to-day life and what's happening on campus. And that means that the previous supposed public good argument of investing in the future of why we spend money on higher education is now exhausted. Opinion has declined across the general public about the value of these things, and now the academic left is freaking out.
Well, one way you could think about conservatism in culture, in a society, is the capacity and willingness of regular people to tell big government, big corporations, big brother, whoever, screw you, right? I'm not going to do what you tell me. You're not the boss of me. Like it's a fundamental resistance, a posture of not wanting to leave the path that our society is on just because somebody read a book and decided he knows how to do it better. And so then you ask the health of conservatism. It's, again, that what institutions support, is that predisposition still here, right? And that's questionable, probably depends on who and where. And then do the institutions around you, like your courts, what you're taught, your community, do they support that posture or not? And I think that's where, if I were like in charge of doing conservatism, which thank God nobody is, that's where I would focus, is trying to understand what makes those kinds of people tick, and how do we support them? Because the people that we rely on to elect the people that we think at the margin might do somewhat better than the alternative, they're not going to read Hayek. They don't care about indexed capital gains or whatever, right? They have some fundamental basic concerns, and my critique of our movement is I think sometimes we don't concern ourselves enough with their actual burdens and fears, and then we are shocked when young men find the NatCons more attractive, or Mamdani, or the weirdo who shot the United Healthcare guy. We're just shocked. Why are these young people attracted to this stuff? And maybe we ought to ask, why are they not attracted to what we're selling? And maybe that's because what we're selling is not relevant to them, and we have to figure out how to make it relevant to them.
I think, too, one of the beliefs that conservatives have, or should have, is that everything is not politics. There are some things that aren't politics. There are actually most things aren't politics. Politics is one thing, it's important, and it's important to participate in, especially in a democracy, but it is not everything, and it can't solve everything. It also can't ruin everything. There are things that are outside of that, and so every political battle is not life and death, and politics doesn't have any permanent victories or defeats either. There's a lot of cycles to a lot of these things. If you're in a low point of the cycle, you'll be in a high point later. You'll be in a low point later. It works that way. And if you talk to older people who have been in politics for a long time, they'll tell you that. And so I think there's a healthy perspective that comes with conservatism that can prevent you from losing your mind over politics. And unfortunately, that disposition is not. It is not only found on the right, and the opposite of that disposition is also not only found on the right. We see people on the right who seem to be prone to that catastrophizing, even though we might more readily notice it on the left. So I think there's that part of the conservative disposition. Everything is not politics is really important to remember.
One of the things that is often thrown at us by the people for whom the title of this panel is an accusation is the idea that we have sold the sort of people that Tony is talking about sold their birthright for a mess of Chinese pottage. To what extent is that true? To what extent did we concentrate so much on the economics that we forgot about the sort of people that Tony is talking about? Phil?
Well, I think free market economics has become the common scapegoat of not only the socialist far left, but this kind of post-liberal scene on the right. And yet, if you look at both of these groups, their arguments, they don't even understand economics at a basic level. And I mean that in all seriousness. Orrin Cass could not competently explain what comparative advantage means. I can, in fact, ask him that question, and he cannot answer it. This is a recurring issue, but at the same time, a narrative has emerged that supposedly the libertarian economists have been driving economic policy and thus the entirety of the American right since after the New Deal era. And I sit here scratching my head. It's like, where and when? Okay, we kept taxes down, but government grew. Deficits are out of control. We even kind of stumbled our way into a de facto modern monetary policy in the Biden era that has in some respects been continued by current trends. And yet, somehow, Friedrich Hayek was like guiding all of the scene here. So I think it's just a complete misdiagnosis by people that have aesthetic crank reasons for disliking economies. This goes all the way back to not only the Marxists, the fetishization of the commodity, that was always the left-wing thing, but you also had Thomas Carlyle on the right, ranting and raving in the mid-19th century about the influx of cheap and nasty goods that were causing consumerism to distract us from our moral purpose. This is an aesthetic crankery that extremes tend to gravitate toward, and yet, we can run down the list. I'd invert the question. Ask them, what have they conserved? What has Joseph de Maistre conserved? Nothing. What has Thomas Carlyle conserved? Nothing. What has Carl Schmitt conserved? Nothing. And yet these are supposedly the answers.
Yes, a reminder that Thomas Carlyle called economics the dismal science because it was opposed to slavery.
Right.
Tony.
First of all, I want to say that aesthetic crankery is a great band name.
Yeah.
So do this. Everybody else wants it. I think our side, us, we well-meaning people who are in that conservative libertarian space, it would be good if we thought more about anthropology. And why are we here? What is the purpose of a person? If you believe in that sort of thing, and if we don't think about that deeply, and as conservatives, I think we're supposed to. I think it comes with the package. In fact, we kind of default to a set of policies that we say are meet and right because they yield outcomes that can be measured, and we didn't really think about what we were trying to accomplish in the first place. And I think about the people who will never be in a room like this and don't really care about what we're talking about. We make judgments about how good the policy outcomes are in their lives based on measures that we came up with based on our sense of what they exist for, and maybe they would disagree about why they exist. And I'm not sure what to do about that or with that. Mostly I'm just here with questions, and that's one of them. Can we agree on the purpose of people, the calling of people, if you believe that they are here to consume as much as possible at the lowest possible cost and to enjoy themselves, that might lead to one set of policies that you favor. If you believe that they are created in the image and likeness of a creator and they have callings that are tied to that in some way, you might judge policy outcomes differently. But even if we can't agree on it, I think the fact that regular folks have wants and beliefs about why they're here ought to interest us, especially if we want to sell our package of stuff to them.
Tom, I was wondering if you could sort of bring us home by reminding us just how exceptional America as a country is. I come from the United Kingdom, and that's the Conservative Party there has completely failed to conserve anything that is good and valuable in that kingdom. To what extent should we be looking at not so much what America was like in the 1950s as what the rest of the developed world is like today?
Sure, I think on the economic front, it's very obvious. The low tax stuff that I mentioned earlier. Also just the fact that this is a very rich country. It is a rich country compared to other rich countries. That's a really astonishing accomplishment. But if you get away from economics, you say, we don't care about economics. First of all, you should, but even if you don't, this is a weirdly religious country. We have a very high level of religiosity in the United States compared to other rich countries. It's been declining, as it has been declining in many other places, although the most recent research from Pew shows that decline has basically stopped, and it has stopped at a much higher level than many other rich countries. So that's something that's unusual. That's something that, by the way, Alexis de Tocqueville was talking about, 200 years ago too. So that's not a new thing, and it seems to be something about America that's unusual. But I think the real sign of this is that despite all the problems that we can all talk about, we can all point to, America is still the country that people from all over the planet want to move to. And they want to move here because it's a place that you can be what you were created to be, like Tony was saying before. And that's true from people. That's even true from people who come from other wealthy countries, where their quality of life is usually pretty good. But even there, they see the United States as a beacon to run to. And so I think that the way that people have voted with their feet for the whole history of this country, but even still today, to show their approval of the basic tenets that make us Americans. I think that's the most obvious and most impressive proof of the exceptional nature of this country.
Indeed, I'll be going back to the United Kingdom later this year, and the chances of me being arrested for saying something are probably now infinitely higher than they were when I left in the 1990s. That's not a problem we have here, for which I say, God bless America. I'd just like to thank you all again for your excellent and perspicacious observations this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our panelists for a thoughtful discussion. We'll now break for lunch and networking until 12:30. Please enjoy lunch outside the auditorium and make your way back in by 12:30 as we continue the program at that time.